I think I'm here to speak about why I wrote this book and what it's about a little bit. I've been interested for a long time in the question of political memory, what it is, why we remember certain things at certain times, when do moments from the past really enter into our reality with a great deal of vivid pertinence. When do they suddenly become part of our preoccupations today? It's not automatic. You can stage a commemoration of anything and usually it falls flat because it doesn't necessarily ring with anything that anybody's thinking about today. So when do moments from our collective past align with our present preoccupations and become really relevant? So it's a little abstract, but I think that's the question that's been guiding my work for several years, and my work has for the most part had to do with working on the political memory of big events on the left in France, particularly like May '68 or the Paris Commune. But these are events that are so big that they really transcend the national boundaries and the national context. And in fact, it was my work on the Paris Commune that was the occasion for my getting invited to, and I relate this in the book. It was an invitation to go down to the longest lasting social movement, post-war social movement in France, which was the ZAD at Notre-Dame-des-Landes. Okay, how many of you are really familiar with that? No? I know, it's amazing, but when you consider that it went on for 50 years, it was a 50-year occupation that began in the late 60s when the government decided to build an international airport in the middle of farmland. And the farmers, many of the farmers said, no, we won't sell our land, we won't move. And this actually went on for 50 years. Now what happened was the government tried to wait them out, as usually happens with farmers. They retire, they have kids that don't want to be farmers, and the land gets sold. But in this case, there was some dwindling away, but there were some hardcore people. And then for about 20 years, the government forgot that it was going to build an airport. And then suddenly it remembered again, and in about 2000 it said, oh yeah, we're going to build that airport. And at that point, the farmers said, help. They said, we need help. And a bunch of people moved there. Occupiers, anarchists, naturalists, other younger farmers. They moved there, and for many years, there was this motley assortment of very, very different kinds of people living together, occupying the territory, and preventing the government from getting started on building the airport. Now, they used all sorts of methods, and I'll get into that later, but when I went down there, it was a very creative moment for the people there because they had been viciously attacked with war, grenades, tanks, and everything by the government, just trying to clear them out physically. And they had rebuilt. And they had rebuilt with a bunch of support from other people around the country. And they were trying at that point to figure out to find a model, to sort of say, how are we going to keep going? And many of them were very interested in Chiapas as a model. And then others began to voyage back in time, and they became quite fascinated by the idea of the Paris Commune and what had gone on there, and a number of things that I had written about, including this idea of communal luxury, which we can discuss later since you all are related to the arts. It's a sort of an artistic concept. But anyway, they wanted to be able to use the Paris Commune as an archive, as a kind of usable, a toolbox, a set of tools to continue on with their movement. Now, I think that what interests me about contemporary ecological movements and the form that they take, and here I'm talking about things like, that are probably more familiar to you, like Standing Rock, yes, no? Stop Cop City, okay. And their equivalents in Europe and elsewhere, like the Larzac forest in Germany, or the or this Zad that I'm talking about in Western France. And these are I think these are extremely important movements because they really do intervene in against the kind of capitalist destruction of the environment that we've all been living through. But they also do something else. They change how we look back at, say, the second half of the 20th century, or my lifetime up until now, which would be, they reconfigure what counts about, say, the 1960s or the 1970s. They give us a revised understanding of what counts for us in history, what parts of history matter to us. And I'm a kind of peculiar historian because I do not believe that the past enlightens the present. I believe the opposite. I believe that the present tells us what in the past is worth remembering and what is worth forgetting. You know, and that changes constantly. But right now, I think that the movements of today and the form that they take are, they change, they suddenly they make us capable of going back to the 60s and 70s and saying, oh yes, that's when peasants outside of Tokyo in Japan fought for 10 years to stop the building of the Narita airport. Now they failed, but it doesn't matter. 10 years, vicious, violent, armed struggle against the state. A very similar thing happened in France at exactly the same time. Another 10-year struggle, and this one succeeded. But once again, the government announced that it was going to seize the land of some farmers who actually make Roquefort cheese, sheep farmers. And they were going to use that land and turn it into an army training camp. And there were 103 farming families there, and they made a pact. They said, not one of us will sell. And they held out. And it was a prefiguration of what happened at the Zad, because the same vague thing happened where people came to help them. People came, and believe me, it's the widest assortment of people that you can imagine. Black bloc anarchists, nuns, lawyers, lesbian separatists, naturalists who don't even believe in agriculture, across the board, and I think that a philosopher that I talk about a lot in this book, Henri Lefebvre, he made the remark back in the 70s, and it's more and more true now. He said, any struggle over land is going to necessarily create the strangest alliances. It's in other words, alliances that transcend identity, that transcend ideology. the sharing an enemy in common makes the kinds of, sectarianism that we're familiar with on the left disappear, really. I mean, not, immediately, but it's a necessary part of these kinds of movements. We'll come back to that. But just to get back to the kind of larger historical argument I'm making is, I think that once you have these new movements that recast our vision of the past, suddenly the 60s and 70s become another name for the moment when defending the very possibility of life on the planet becomes the decisive thing, the decisive part. Let's say it's the horizon of any kind of political struggle. So you may be involved in something else. You might be trying to deal with various kinds of social inequalities, but you still have to do it now in such a way that you are also defending the possibility of life on the planet. So, what I wanted to postulate in the book was the existence of a form that gathers together all of these experiences from the Paris Commune in the 19th century, an aspect of May 68 that I talk about in the book in the first chapter that occurred in the city of Nantes, when you suddenly had a coalition develop between farmers, striking workers, aerospace workers, and students. And the farmers began to basically feed the revolution. I mean, they began to feed the families of the striking workers so that the striking workers could continue the strike longer. And the students acted as go-betweens and conduits for this kind of network to develop. And suddenly the whole city was everybody else was on strike, right, including the government. So suddenly the whole city was being self-managed in this way. It only lasted a few weeks, but it doesn't matter. So a situation like that, or a situation like what occurred at Notre-Dame-des-Landes, or Stop Cop City. Now, when I say form, I don't mean a model, because every time the commune form occurs or is manifest or is built, really, it's different because it has to respond to particular situations and the needs of the particular people who are doing it, who are building it. So it changes according to geography and according to history, but in all of these instances, it's a political movement that's also a collective elaboration of a way of life, because you are living together, you're sharing a territory with all of the challenges that brings. It involves taking charge, taking responsibility individually, collectively, for subsistence. And it is always linked to a particular space. It's always linked to a territory. It's not an abstraction. It's not a theoretical abstraction. It's not a concept. It's actually about building spaces in the most literal sense of the term and building them collectively. Now, in the second part of the book, I tried to isolate a few of the practices that make up the political intelligence of these kinds of movements. And I want to say just a few words about the first one. I think you guys read about composition or appropriation. I want to talk a little bit about the idea of defense, because I'm very interested in the whole problem of what kinds of solidarity we're going to need to build a post-productionist world. And when I went down to Notre-Dame-des-Landes, I saw the kind of solidarity that I was mentioning, a solidarity across real diversity. And I began to think to myself, why is it that defense, movements involving defense, generate far more solidarity and a stronger solidarity than resistance? You know, we're often called upon to resist, and I began to think about, well, what really is the difference? And I think that when we defend, we are beginning with something that we already have and that we love or that we cherish and that we want to protect. But when we resist, the state is setting the agenda. It's almost like we've already lost, and all we can do is resist all of the power that we're attributing to the other side. When we defend, we set the agenda. We decide what we value, why we value it, why we want to protect it. And that's a very, very powerful kind of a place to begin. And it changes over time, because you can begin by, say, defending your neighborhood from a development, or you may begin by defending a piece of agricultural land or an unpolluted area or something like that. But as time goes by, since these struggles tend to be protracted, as time goes by, you actually end up defending the collective life project and the social relations that have developed during the defense. So we make our community by defending it. The second of these practices is appropriation, and and here once again it's Henri Lefebvre that gives us, I think, an amazing insight. He says that people, individuals or groups, it doesn't matter, simply cannot constitute themselves as political subjects unless they produce a space. And by producing a space, he means both a social space and a physical space. So you cannot become a political subject without producing a space that you create and that you appropriate and that you for yourselves. And if you need a practical definition of the commune-form, there it is. It's this idea of a collective appropriation of a space, not in the sense of a possession, but in the sense of a creation, of an oeuvre, of something that you are making together. A collective creation, and that is what actually produces political subjectivity. So if you think about it that way, we're talking about something that is far more demanding, far more exigent than a mere idea like justice or a theory. because it presupposes existential transformation. It actually involves living differently. And that's exactly what these people say the occupiers at Stop Cop City are doing. Or even the occupiers last spring in the Gaza occupations. They were living differently. Now, as for composition, I already mentioned a little bit of what it's about. It is this idea of very diverse populations living together and not really forming a consensus. It's not about consensus. These are very polemical communities. I mean, you wouldn't believe the kinds of arguments and fights that go on. I mean, or the general assemblies that go on for 6 hours before anything is decided. But who are these people? They're not a political party. They're not a social class. They're not an ethnicity. They're not anything that you can recognize, because the commune-form is actually far more inclusive than, say, a group of factory workers or something like that, since it includes the unemployed, it includes animals, it includes babies, the aged, everybody, right? It is a response to that fact, or that idea, that spatial conflicts create these very strange alliances. But the effect is to produce, as I said, a kind of solidarity that has not, we haven't really seen before. I think it really came into being at places like this. And what it shows is that it's not only possible, but it's actually very desirable to work and ally with people with radically different political codes. Insofar as you share an enemy, and insofar as equality and solidarity extends to all the different people who compose the group. Now, I think that the most important factor about this idea of composition is that it works. It's extremely effective. And the reason why the Zods succeeded in their airport battle, the airport was never built. The government gave up. It gave up in the face of this actually existing opposition that they finally, they washed their hands of the plan. It took forever, but the reason why the group succeeded in existing for as long as it did is that, and even though they had so many different elements with very different political methods, you know, violence, nonviolence, neither were fetishized. Legal things, illegal things, it didn't matter. They made no attempt to come together on questions like that. The ones who wanted to do that, they did that, they did that. So you had, and when you have this kind of complementarity of methods, it's extremely hard for the state to intervene, because it's hard for the state to figure out who they're dealing with exactly. You know, you had these elderly farmers, and in France, elderly farmers have a great deal of social credibility. You know, they're really quite respected members of the community. And they can organize blockages with their tractors, which they do regularly. You had the scientific knowledge of the naturalists who were busy, charting the flora and fauna and figuring out where the endangered species were, listing them. You had the kind of practical knowledge of the anarchists, knowledge of squats, knowledge of how to pilfer electricity, how to do various things. You had the direct action of anarchists who were not at all afraid of frontal sort of combat with the police. And then you had a whole array of people who were busy working the courts, who had legal knowledge and who could put various kinds of delays into the court system. And you had punks who were improvisational and very creative. So all of this combines to form an endless offensive that's constantly changing and that is very difficult for the state to conquer easily, or even to recuperate, or even to, pacify in any way. You might think of it under a musical analogy, like an orchestra, where at certain times of the musical movement, the horns are very loud, and the violins are recessive, but then the violins come in and the horns fade out. So it's a very, very effective mode of political labor. And it gets back to the whole perception that was made by Kropotkin in the 19th century. He said, solidarity is not a feeling. It's not an ethos. It's not, it is a revolutionary strategy, and it's the most important one of all. Okay, so let's see. I wanted to write a very short book, and I succeeded. And the reason is that since a lot of the book talks about the capitalist destruction of the lived environment, when it comes to the capitalist destruction of the lived environment, we actually already know everything. We know everything now. We have known everything since Rachel Carson in 1963 with Silent Spring. We've probably known everything since the 1920s when people like Jacques Ellul were writing. We may have already known everything since the 19th century when some of the communard thinkers that I wrote about in an earlier book began a kind of proto-ecologist discourse in the late 19th century, right after the Paris Commune. So if we already know everything, then there's no use continuing to gather data or to predict catastrophes or repeat all of those prophecies that will end up undoubtedly being fulfilled, probably, that everything has become too complex for us to intervene indirectly. And so I wanted to end the book with the comment that what something like the ZAD at Notre-Dame-des-Landes shows us is that it is very possible to seize hold of the machine and throw it in reverse. They won. And the movement that has emerged from the experience of the ZAD, with which I conclude the book, is a move. There's no more chalk anymore, is there?
Second.
Chalk doesn't exist, does it?
We have, somebody might have a marker.
Can you just use any kind of marker?
No, but we have. That doesn't stop people from doing it anyway.
Well,
sometimes,
I know though. Oh, well, this one's
that
okay,
good.
right?
You're good.
Yeah,
Okay.
that's good.
All right. So this is.
The professors in the room all came ready. So.
Okay, Soulèvements de la terre, uprisings of the earth, or SLT as it's come to be known. This is a group that at this very moment is busy establishing a set of priorities and going on the offensive against land seizure and the sacking of land in France. And they've announced that they see their task as linking up the land, the earth of the paysan, of the farmers, with the planet of the ecologists. So their focus really is on agricultural land. And I know in the big city this is probably not like a pressing problem, but in France, half of France is agricultural land. And half of that land is going to change hands in the next 10 years as farmers retire or whatever. And so half of that will, unless something is done, be absorbed by agribusiness with these huge monocultural farms, or it'll be paved over. So this is what this group has decided out of many possibilities. You know, when it comes to the destruction of the environment, you have many choices, but they've decided to focus on the question of agricultural land. And they see their enemy as something that we can thank Dwight D. Eisenhower for. I mean, Dwight D. Eisenhower called it the military-industrial complex back during the phrase we always used during the Vietnam War. So they talk about the agro-industrial complex, which is a good way of thinking about it, because if you think seriously about what's involved, you're talking about huge parts of the government, you're talking about seed research, seed patenting, farm machinery, supermarkets, how food gets distributed, research, pesticides, the banks that give loans to farmers or refuse to, the zoning of what constitutes agricultural land, the insurance, you know, that goes into all of this. This is all part of an enormous complex which SLT has targeted as the enemy. And the interesting thing about this group is that, which the government tried very hard to shut down last year, which inspired a whole, I think, 200,000 people to join the group, including people like Noam Chomsky, the entire Zapatista community, Greta Thunberg. You know, I mean, it was like everyone is now a member of SLT. Perhaps some of you are members. Is what's interesting to me is, again, this use of the commune-form. And the difference, I mentioned that the commune-form has to reinvent itself every time it comes into being. And in the case of SLT, they've solved a problem that really plagued the communards of the 19th century. And that is the problem that when the Paris Commune occurred, their biggest problem was that they were blocked off from communicating with anyone in the countryside. They were using, what are they called, those pigeons, like messenger pigeons and things. And they were blocked off from even communicating with these emergent communes in other cities. So they were in a state of absolute isolation. And they could not do what they wanted to do, which was to essentially, what they called, federate with other communes. And I think what SLT has done, because what they do is they go around and they amplify local struggles. It might be, you know, protecting a worker's community garden, or it might be attacking Monsanto, actually going into the factories and sabotaging them. It might be their biggest action that really drove. I think I sent that article, didn't I? Yeah, about the the water hoarding that's going on now in Europe, and soon I'm sure here, if not already, where agribusiness farmers are pumping all of the water out of the water table and hoarding it for themselves, so that in a particular region, only 6% of the farmers have access to the water, and the smaller farmers have no access. So this is happening in Spain, and it's happening in France, and SLT has attacked they're called mega basins. You would not believe the size of these things. I would say that the ones that I've seen, I've at least seen 2 that were the size of the Pratt campus. They're enormous. You can't even believe it. And the water just evaporates, you know. And they claim that they're just storing rainwater, but SLT has dug up the pipes and shown, you know, the whole pumping system that has gone on to stockpile what is obviously a natural resource available to everyone. So they go from different regions in the country, amplify these struggles, but what they're essentially doing is, let me back up a little bit. In the Middle Ages, the communes were very chauvinistic. You know, they defended their little region against everybody, all the other communes. But what SLT is doing is it's creating a structure. They're very organized. They're not a political party, they're not anything, but they are organized. And they've come up with a way to essentially link these local struggles together. I see this as they've solved the problem of federation. They have created something like a common horizon of situated struggles. Okay, I think I'll end there.
All right, thank you.
Thank you.
So we'll open it up for questions, both here and on Zoom. So if anybody would like to start us off, feel free. Don't be shy. Yeah, you right?
Sure.
Yeah. Okay.
I mean, students should speak first and more than us. But I just to you know, might as well try to open up the conversation. But you know, I have not read this new book of yours. I'm familiar with your previous work on the Paris Commune. But what I know of your new book is from an essay that I just read by a political theorist named Kevin Duong. And and so I thought I would just sort of invite you to comment on an observation that Kevin makes. But Kevin Duong is like Kristin Ross is a political theorist who works on radical politics in France, and a fellow France specialist. But what Kevin Duong says in this essay is that if you want the thing about Kristin Ross and her work, if you really want to understand her, so you have to understand is that she lives in the Hudson Valley. And so I just want, yeah, you're talking about, ways I think I can see some of the horizon of that, but just invitation to to think locally about what that might mean, and and how we might think about our immediate agriculture or other struggles or politics close to home here.
Yeah, yeah. No, I thought that was a kind of an amazing essay by Kevin. Really amazing. It's and he says he says, oh, I always thought Kristin was talking about France, and then I realized she was actually talking about the Hudson Valley. So, I think he's right. I mean, certainly we've seen the kinds of struggles over development that have gone on up there and continue to go on up there. I'll come back to the Hudson Valley, but one of the things that impresses me about these mostly young people in SLT is they've been brilliant at forcing people in the cities to become aware of the crimes in the countryside. And that is one of the hardest things in the world to do, because ever since forever, especially on the left, city dwellers really do not perceive the countryside, or they don't perceive it they might perceive it in certain kinds of ways, vacations or excursions, something, but the actual crimes committed by agribusiness, for example, are very, very hard for city dwellers to even have any kind of consciousness of. And I think that is the major thing that they've done over there in France, is that they've forced people. When I told friends of mine in Paris that I was going down to see, to one of these actions around and we were going to we ended up in some field outside of some tiny town in the middle, and my friends in Paris said, but that's the middle of nowhere. You're going to the middle of nowhere. And I thought, that's an interesting philosophical question at this point. What is the middle of nowhere? Is it outer space filled with all the tech toys of billionaires? Is that the middle of nowhere? Or is some field outside of a megabassine in the middle of nowhere? I mean, we could have a big debate about what constitutes nowhere now. But certainly for people in big cities, most of the countryside is the middle of nowhere. And back in the 19th century, Élisée Reclus, a geographer, a communard, and an ecologist, was convinced that the greatest problem facing the left was that city dwellers are not even aware of the fact that they are not perceiving this whole set of problems and set of crimes. And in the case of the movement that I mentioned to block the Narita airport in Japan, that was a movement that was led by farmers. It was led by paysans who literally buried themselves in the dirt to prevent the machines from coming in to build the airport. They actually, they had a whole set of underground tunnels where they existed as which they learned from Vietnamese peasants who had done the same thing during the Vietnamese War. I mean, the U.S. war on Vietnam. So, but they were joined, these peasants were joined by students from Tokyo. And students from Tokyo would regularly go out to help in these battles. And along the way, the students from Tokyo, for the very first time ever, gave a thought to where their food came from. They had never thought about it once, you know. So, and there was a change in consciousness among the farmers as well, because the farmers, they started out just wanting to defend their way of life, the way their families had always lived. But along the way, they were forced to recognize the amazing level of violence that the state was capable of directing against them. So this is the kind of, you know, composition that we're talking about. And I don't know, you know, the Hudson Valley. New York City's relationship to the Hudson Valley. I live right next to the reservoir that feeds feeds the water for all of New York City. And I remember that the day after 9/11, I went there with a friend of mine who was Japanese. And he was Japanese, he was Japanese. And he had a camera. And the reservoir was swarming with cops. And they actually tried to arrest him because he looked other in some way, and he had a camera, and they were convinced that Al-Qaeda was coming to poison the reservoir of New York City, and that he was somehow an advanced agent for for Al-Qaeda. So there are these very, very strange kinds of vibes that you can pick up on in the city-country relationship. But it's I don't know if I've answered your question. I'm just talking.
Something in the text that I noticed was, I thought it was interesting how you mentioned after the victory over the airport, that they had the kind of enemy that they're fighting is less tangible. And thinking about that now and kind of how, on like a general scale, we're kind of aware that there's like climate change and things happening, but it's easy to kind of think of it in like an abstract way or push it off or think of it as like happening somewhere else. I guess I'm just curious as to if you think that there's like what level of tangibility is needed to kind of unite people on like a widespread scale that is like able to make a significant impact, I guess.
Well, see, I think they would say you don't worry about the scale question, and take that abstraction and bring it down to earth and bring it to a specific piece of earth and worry about that. And once you start, you have to start somewhere, and the good thing about SLT is they're very pragmatic, they're very practical, and they believe in action, because action creates dreams and desires, not the reverse. It's only action that gives you a horizon, that gives you a kind of your own utopian horizon to orient yourself towards. And if you don't act, you can start anywhere, really, but you have to start somewhere. And they would say, yeah, I think they would say the scale question is a red herring, because once you get started, things happen, and there's movement. There's
Okay. While people are thinking, thank you for all of this. It's really rich text and way of framing all of this. And I was wondering about how the movements that you're chronicling here relate to some of the other rural agitation that's been happening recently in Europe, which seems not necessarily directly opposed to big agriculture, right? But acting in defense of pesticide use or fossil fuel subsidies or whatever, right? Is this, do you think that the sort of like the composition has helped to stave some of that off in places where SLT has been active compared to other spots in Europe, or are there ways in which some of those networks are also like being hijacked for other purposes? I'm just sort of curious if you think that because it relies on bringing together people with, like you said, extremely diverse material interests and ideologies, if there's a worry about the sort of like mutation or co-optation of some of that stuff. Yeah.
Well, last year there was a huge amount of agricultural unrest in France, and it was mostly coming from the right.
Yeah.
And large swaths of farming in France is dominated by the right.
Yeah.
And they have their own unions, and the union that SLT works with is the Confédération Paysanne, which goes back to, José Bové. You might remember that name. The guy who, he blew up a McDonald's, and then he blew up a genetically modified cornfield. He did his time, and now he's some sort of a representative at the European Union or something. He's gone, straight in terms of his politics. But anyway, that union is a left farmers union. So I don't really know the answer to your question, but the way that I would try to find out would be to look at all of that turbulence from last year and see who benefited from it in terms of the number of farmers who went towards Confédération Paysanne and the others who moved towards the right-wing unions. Like, where did and I don't know the answer to that.
Yeah, I guess like I was thinking about it in connection with the previous question, right? Because like you can have these local struggles about particular conditions that then also bring in like larger, more global, general concerns.
Mm-hmm.
And I guess I just sort of was like thinking about like the tenuousness, the potentially tenuous character of that move, right? Of just sort of like starting from particularity and like working your way out towards these broader coalitions that you're hoping are gonna sort of like be in some way durable and transformative, right?
Mm-hmm. Well, it's not just hope, because their SLT, for example, is profiting from a whole previous layer of convivial political labor, which was involved all of the local support committees for the ZAD.
Mm-hmm.
So all across France, a lot of people in France went to the ZAD and came back, and that was true for the Larzac as well. So there was a whole level of political education that took place already that's been stored up, and it is a a kind of tissue of already existing support, which is again that strange thing where you have these very, very specific struggles that are rooted in a region and what that region wants and needs and stuff. But then you have that kind of articulated into this larger network, none of which it's not like there are any directives coming at in a centralized way. It's more like a kind of federation of solidarity.
Right. Good. Yeah. I don't know if other people want to jump in here.
I mean, I don't know quite what the question is, but I was just noticing, I was thinking a lot about right now how, part of what the right is really taking advantage of or using as a political battering ram is, this idea of defending. We make our community by defending it, and the political movement or the collective elaboration of a way of life, the way the nation state sort of co-opts that as a way of constructing the fiction of a nation, or the sort of real fiction of the nation.
Mm-hmm.
And just how seeing the nation state as also engaging in this kind of political, the making of the political subject via an enemy, that it's a defense of a territory, and in a sort of collective, some sort of collective identity that is constituted by diverse interests. And so I'm just thinking about that, and I'm wondering, like, what makes the commune form, or how can the commune form become resistant to the same impulses, or the same, I don't know what the word is, mechanisms, or
It's very anti-state, for one thing. It only really comes into being in moments when the state is absent or withdrawn. So it begins as an anti-state sort of a formation that nevertheless kind of doubles for a state, in that they try to provide what the state has been delinquent in providing. Like, it's just the old idea of dual power, or
constitutive assembly.
the dual power, or something like what the Black Panther Party did in Oakland or Detroit, when they set up a whole way of feeding the kids in their neighborhoods, or just doing what the state actually is not doing. So I think with the U.S., it's always easy to leap up to the national, as in your question. And also, of course, the U.S. has all these bizarro kind of right-wing I would not call them communes, but you do have things like Waco or Ruby Ridge, or any of these kind of pathological formations. But even though they are small and enclosed, and they're totally different. I mean, they're built around patriarchy. They're built around, just kind of a whole repudiation of anything like equality, or any of those ways of conducting oneself. So, but yeah, I mean, they would say they were defending themselves too. Israel says it's defending itself. Yeah. So, I'm talking about defense in a very kind of specific way, I think, around this.
It's also interesting to think about the ways, like in your book on the Paris Commune, one of the images that stands with me so much is the way that they would build tunnels behind the fronts of the buildings, so that they could, that they could move without being seen, or they could easily move, and then, and then the Israeli state also then using a similar maneuver, which they called the neighbor procedure in Palestinian villages, and that the army would come in and burrow through the walls so that they could move. And so just sort of like, then it seems like there's something, there's something not about the form that is actually has a political valence. But
Well, that's more of a like a military tactic of some kind. Yeah.
So I take it, like, the force of the question is sort of like, are there, if you're talking about form, like, are there formal characteristics that you would point to sort of like distinguish a left-wing version of the kinds of strategies that you're looking at here from right-wing versions of it or appropriations of it or something like that, or do we just like certainly I think like pointing to the idea of equality is like is central here, but I was wondering if there are other things for you that that you would point to in trying to sort of like differentiate.
Well, yeah, I mean, I think of the equality thing in a kind of Rancierian sense of equality not being some reward that you get at the end of the train ride, but in fact is something that you have to presume from the outset, and you presume it, and then you demonstrate it, and then you verify it over and over again, which would mean that in your actual conduct with your fellow communards, that kind of equality is verified daily, in a daily way. And again, you know, like, that's why something like Waco or doesn't really fit the model. You know, those formations seem to me to be exaggerations of patriarchy, and I think it is true that probably you could say in the 19th century people like Kropotkin and Reclus were very worried about factors like the extreme isolation that would lead to a kind of patriarchal, you know, figure who would begin to emerge or something like that. And I suppose you could say that must always be combated in some way, in the same way that every kind of factor of living together with people, you know, like really working at what do you do about sexually aggressive people, you know, or let's say violence against women. What do you do about it? Do you just throw the guy out? You can't call the cops. You can't, you know, you have to adjudicate it in some way, right? Those are the kinds of problems that they were dealing with over the years. And it was incredibly difficult.
So along those lines, if I can come back to a point that you made earlier about the commune-form, when you said, exactly, but you said that one of its characteristics was that it was a way of living together and defending together of people who had extremely different and often opposed political views or outlooks. And so the question
it's
is,
not more like political codes.
Okay, so that's what I wanted to press it. So what is the relevant range of difference that you are encompassing within this, and what happens to that? Does that, and like, so people come in with different political codes, do they end up with, does that end up being an education away from the difference?
Sometimes, but sometimes it doesn't. You know, sometimes people just stay in I mean, there's a lot of changes that can go on, especially over the years, right? But the main idea is of a complementarity of method.
Mm-hmm.
You know, so that you and this really comes down to the question of frequently of legal or illegal, particularly. So especially in a movement which included some elected officials who were regularly there, or lawyers who were regularly there, but then also people who were engaging in full-scale sabotage of machinery and things like that. So, but the decision was that you didn't try to convert people. You didn't try to say my method is superior. You just went about your business, and so that there was never there was never a consensus. It was always polemical, but it was permitted, you know.
But what, yeah, it's permitted and
Because
what
they
permitted?
had a shared enemy.
Because they have a shared enemy, so there
Yes.
is so you're not there, right, unless you are sharing,
I'll give you an
that.
example. When I translated a book that they wrote, I was trying to come up with a title and a subtitle, and I forgot. I somehow suggested something that had the word anti-capitalist in it, because I perceived the movement as being generally anti-capitalist. But when I said that, they said, no, the older farmers wouldn't want that. See? But they were working together, right? And many of the people there would have said, yes, I am anti-capitalist. But the important thing was to work together.
Maybe I could, I don't
No,
I don't
keep
want to take
going.
up the whole discussion, but I'm thinking, you know, trying to, you know, think through this, you know, and responding to the points you made, and that, you know, as someone who you know, I work in political theory and am very interested in, you know, have been interested in these kinds of movements, but there's a tendency of people who work in political theory to want some further horizon. I mean, and there's arguments about whether we should want this further horizon, but you know, the horizon is supposed to be revolution. You know, let's right. What is the, you know, what is the takeaway? You know, beyond this struggle, this local struggle here, and of course, you know, one of the problems of revolution, successful revolution, is that, you know, if you do succeed at having your you know, then, you know, how do you relate that to all the people who didn't show up, who didn't see that common enemy, who were the common enemy, you know, were that enemy. And it may be that you don't need to worry about that if what you're worrying about is defending and being a part of this form. And in light of that, and so you know, just thinking aloud that, you know, maybe that, you know, you know, you can table that for now because you've got enough to do. So
Yes, because it's very practical.
so the question I mean, it's a sort of a question just thinking aloud, is to come back to something you said earlier when you said defense works better than resistance. You know, it's more powerful, it's defense versus resistance. You know, the idea.
I said that it creates a stronger solidarity.
Creates a stronger solidarity. It's a different kind of thing. It's something to look for. So that, I mean, and that's it's an interesting and potentially powerful way to be thinking about, you know, where to put your energies.
Yeah.
Right. If you like, I think a lot of people who, you know, for better or for worse, find ourselves living in a place like New York City, you know, aren't seeing ourselves as, you know, attached to things in the same immediate way, right? To know that there is a thing there to defend. You know, we can look to, with kind of romanticism, look to standing rock. Yes, that's wonderful. I can go there. I can help them defend. But if you don't have that consciousness now, that's not the first thing that's going to come to mind. Maybe it should be. Maybe that's a way of thinking about, you know, developing a different kind of political consciousness.
Well, I think we've all forgotten the fantasy that private property is going to get abolished in one fell swoop by a central decree from a revolutionary power, or, you know, all of those kind of models of revolution are gone. You know, I mean, and you can fill that in with a kind of nihilism, which a lot of people have done, or a melancholy or something like that. But I think that this stuff is, this mode of action is actually, it's one way of creating, I would still call it a revolutionary movement. It's just that the temporality is different. You know, it's not going, you know, private property is not going to end for everybody across the planet in one fell swoop. It's none of that is possible. That's like a dream, as though as though some state government in our time is going to respond actively and positively to a climate march in its capital. And that's the biggest fantasy in the world. So you have to really start somewhere. And I think that maybe the problem is with political theory, because political theory is always something that comes in after the fact and tries to measure everything according to its criteria.
Well, the only thing I will say in defense of political theory is that, which is not much, but only that I think, circling back to people like Kevin Braun, that it's less of a problem in political theory than it had been.
That's true. Political theory is getting better.
But it is. It is
It
because politics is getting better. But we're thinking about things like seeing different ways to think about things as politics is thinking about something different. In this whole conversation, being and I know the students here are going to just think this makes me sound like I'm very old, but I think it shows that I'm young, is that what I'm thinking of, what I personally, in a certain sense, having come of age in a certain way, time within the era of Occupy, how that, looking back on those months in New York City, how that began as something and then it became something else, and then it, and there was, and I think still is, a certain amount of ambivalence about thinking about, is it, and with any encampment, with protest encampments, it doesn't, what happens when it seems to be more about the encampment itself, as an end in itself? Is that a problem? Is that interesting? How to think about that. And it seems to me that you're offering us a way into thinking about some of those kinds of questions.
No, I think the encampment in and of itself is fascinating. You're defending the lawn, but along the way, I think Kevin says this. He says, you end up raising the whole question of what universities are for. But it's also about daily life, It's mostly about that. It's about coming up with a way of deciding who you're going to invite to speak, what books you're putting in the library, what you're going to eat for dinner. All that is the writing this book. I got to go back to a lot of these thinkers from the 70s, not just Lefebvre, but people like Gortz and Bookchin and all of the big eco people from the 70s. And what struck me the most, Silvia Federici, is that they all come from the problem of everyday life. That's where they start. And that's what's posed by these kinds of occupations, is the direct question of how are we going to live? How are we going to live tomorrow?
Is there time for that?
Yeah.
Yeah, so I wanted you to follow from the everydayness, in two directions, the urban and the rural, because I can also see ways in which there have been, occupations, formations of, directed projects on how to live around anti-development, around protecting different neighborhoods and schools, and then the ways in which that the people who lived around there, in order to maintain a life, in order to kind of keep yourself from having to do the compromise, you have to form your own schools, you have to form, your own ways of producing food, and you begin to create, there are stories one could tell and there are memories one could have. But another thing that is different, of course, is the symbolism and the intensity and the mystique of rural land and agriculture in France versus the U.S. And different histories about the occupation of land in this country, and and then the cruelty and the violence of that. So we have like a history of what it is to occupy land that's connected to imperialism and violence,
Right.
as opposed to a kind of story about I don't know what the story of agriculture is, but there are different things one could say. So that to say, well, half of France is rural, and there's a passion, there's a love and identification for that. Even so, if there's a confrontation between agribusiness and all these people from different backgrounds, politically, class, whatever, you can draw on that. You can draw on the great goddess of farming. In the U.S., or so take the Hudson Valley, where would you find those resources, the symbolic resources for that the attachment, the love of the preservation of rural land and farming.
Well, I think you can find it in the Hudson Valley. I'm not sure you can find it in Nebraska in the
Yeah.
same way, you
Yeah.
know, which has been,
Well, Catherine.
I mean, dominated for so long by agribusiness. The Hudson Valley and up through Vermont is still at least a bit family farms, a bit.
Yeah, and it's also
So-
people started
so
farms
once you-
again,
yeah,
which is
once
just
you-
different from France, where you have people draining from the family farms. I think in you know, I have a place in western Massachusetts, and people are, you know, there's lots of people, but then there's also people who want to come and do it and want to learn.
That's right.
So that's
That's
it's
right.
starting again.
There's a whole set of new farmers in the Hudson Valley who are trying to deal with the fact that because of COVID, you know, and the flight of the super rich to the area, the land has gotten any kind of agricultural land up there has gotten so expensive that it's hard for a new person to get started.
And it's hard to pay their workers a living wage because the housing costs have gotten so high. And
Yeah.
how they can go from
Exactly.
to impressive.
Mhm. And the other problem is that, you know, I live in an area that's almost all apple farms, and those apples tend to be picked by migrant workers who have been coming up regularly in a very, I don't know, it seems like a very calm, reasonable way. They have the same people come year after year, they stay for this harvest and then they go back, but they're being blocked.
I think there's something happening a lot with urban farming movements and urban, you know, food movements. That's interesting because it's not so much about the movement or the new political subjectivities being about defense of something that already exists, but about sort of, you know, getting into the interstices
Yeah.
of the urban, the fallow areas and planting and then that becomes the space for the development of the shared political momentum, which then becomes something to defend.
Mm-hmm.
And of course, the heyday of that, the history of that in New York City, you know, the 70s were really important. But I do feel like there was something interesting that opened up during COVID in New York City about that, because people suddenly were like, oh, yeah, public space, social space, public space.
Right.
So, yeah, just thinking about that. Yeah.
Maybe you know whatever happened with that Elizabeth Street garden?
In the Lower East Side?
Yeah.
I mean, I think the Lower East Side gardens are pretty hard, they would be hard to get rid of at this point.
Adams was going to get rid of them. Adams was going to get rid of the Elizabeth Street garden.
I don't think he was able to.
Uh-huh.
Yeah,
They're, yeah, I mean, it's like